Sheriff Mark Reynolds, a veteran law enforcement officer with more than 2 decades of service in the county sheriff's department, appeared in court this week following an internal investigation and subsequent criminal charges related to misconduct while on duty. According to court records, the case stemmed from a traffic stop conducted earlier this year, in which Reynolds was accused of abusing his authority, violating departmental procedures, and making statements that were later determined to be misleading. The incident prompted a formal complaint from a civilian, leading the sheriff's department to place Reynolds on administrative leave pending review. Investigators testified that dashboard camera footage, body-worn camera recordings, and radio logs contradicted key parts of Reynolds' initial report. Prosecutors stated that the evidence showed Reynolds failed to follow established protocol, improperly escalated the encounter, and attempted to use his position to influence the outcome of the stop. The department's Internal Affairs Division concluded its inquiry by forwarding the findings to the district attorney's office, which filed charges including official misconduct and falsification of records. The case was heard in a municipal court presided over by Judge Frank Caprio. During the proceedings, the court reviewed video evidence, heard testimony from department supervisors, and considered Reynolds' service record. Judge Caprio noted that while prior service and rank are relevant factors, they do not exempt any individual from accountability under the law. In delivering the ruling, the court emphasized the principle of equal application of justice, stating that public trust in law enforcement depends on consistent enforcement of legal standards. Reynolds was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced in accordance with state guidelines. The ruling included fines, mandatory ethics retraining, and a recommendation for decertification review by the State Law Enforcement Standards Board. Following the verdict, the Sheriff's Department issued a statement acknowledging the court's decision and reaffirming its commitment to transparency, accountability, and adherence to professional standards. The case has since drawn attention from legal experts and oversight organizations as an example of judicial scrutiny applied uniformly, regardless of position or authority. The case against Sheriff Mark Reynolds originated from a routine traffic stop that escalated into a formal misconduct investigation, highlighting how standard law enforcement encounters can trigger serious legal consequences when procedures are not followed. According to official records, the incident occurred during a late evening patrol when Reynolds stopped a civilian vehicle for an alleged traffic violation. What initially appeared to be a minor enforcement action quickly raised concerns after the driver filed a detailed complaint, alleging that Reynolds acted outside departmental guidelines, used inappropriate authority, and provided information during the encounter that did not align with established policy. Following the complaint, the Sheriff's Department initiated a preliminary review, which is standard protocol when allegations involve a sworn officer. This review led to the preservation and examination of all available evidence, including body-worn camera footage, dashboard camera recordings, dispatch audio, and written reports submitted by Reynolds after the stop. Supervisors assigned to the review noted early discrepancies between the officer's written account and the digital evidence collected from department-issued equipment. These inconsistencies prompted the matter to be referred to the Internal Affairs Division for a full investigation. Internal Affairs investigators conducted a comprehensive inquiry over several weeks, interviewing the civilian involved, reviewing footage frame by frame, and consulting departmental policy manuals to determine whether procedures had been violated. Investigators reported that Reynolds deviated from standard traffic stop protocols, including the manner in which he approached the vehicle, the language used during the interaction, and the justification provided for extending the stop beyond its initial purpose. Policies governing officer conduct emphasize de-escalation, clear communication, and accurate documentation, all of which became central to the investigation. One of the most significant findings involved Reynolds' written incident report. Prosecutors later stated that the report contained statements that were inconsistent with time-stamped video and audio evidence. Investigators concluded that certain claims regarding the driver's behavior and the reasons for continued detention were not supported by the recordings. Under department rules and state law, submitting an inaccurate or misleading report constitutes a serious violation, particularly for a senior officer expected to model compliance and professionalism. As the Internal Affairs investigation progressed, Reynolds was placed on administrative leave, a measure intended to preserve the integrity of the inquiry rather than imply guilt. During this period, the department's command staff reviewed Reynolds' service history, training records, and prior evaluations. While his record showed years of experience and prior commendations, investigators emphasized that past performance does not override the obligation to comply with current legal and ethical standards. The department's leadership later stated that accountability mechanisms apply equally to all ranks to maintain public trust. Upon completion of the internal investigation, a formal findings report was submitted to the district attorney's office. The report concluded that there was sufficient evidence to support allegations of official misconduct and falsification of records. Prosecutors reviewed the materials independently, including the digital evidence and sworn statements, before determining that criminal charges were warranted. The decision to file charges marked a significant development, as cases involving senior law enforcement officials often undergo heightened scrutiny to ensure fairness and transparency. The filing of charges brought the matter into the public judicial system, where evidence would be tested through adversarial proceedings rather than internal review alone. Legal experts noted that the transition from departmental discipline to criminal prosecution underscores the seriousness of the alleged violations. Official misconduct statutes are designed to address situations in which public officials misuse their authority or fail to uphold the duties entrusted to them by law. Throughout the pretrial phase, court documents outlined the prosecution's position that Reynolds knowingly violated procedures and attempted to justify his actions through inaccurate documentation. Defense filings acknowledged discrepancies, but argued they were the result of stress, miscommunication, or differing interpretations of events rather than intentional wrongdoing. These arguments set the stage for a trial focused heavily on objective evidence rather than subjective recollections. The investigation and subsequent charges also prompted the Sheriff's Department to issue public statements reaffirming its commitment to oversight and ethical conduct. Department officials emphasized that the internal review process functioned as intended, identifying potential violations and referring them to appropriate authorities. Oversight organizations later cited the case as an example of how internal accountability systems can operate when complaints are supported by verifiable evidence. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the focus had shifted from the individual traffic stop to broader questions of professional responsibility and accuracy in law enforcement reporting. The evidence gathered during the internal investigation formed the foundation of the prosecution's case, illustrating how procedural violations and documentation errors can escalate into criminal matters. The handling of Key Point 1 demonstrates that the initial internal investigation was not a peripheral step, but the central mechanism through which alleged misconduct was identified, documented, and brought before the justice system, reinforcing the principle that adherence to protocol is a fundamental obligation for all law enforcement officers, regardless of rank or tenure. The court proceedings centered on the principle that judicial review applies uniformly to all individuals, regardless of professional status or public position, a point that became central during the hearing overseen by Judge Frank Caprio. As the case moved forward, the court examined the evidence presented by both the prosecution and the defense, focusing on whether the actions taken by Sheriff Mark Reynolds met the legal standards required of a sworn law enforcement officer. The proceedings followed standard judicial procedure, with witnesses sworn in, evidence formally submitted, and arguments presented within the framework of state law and municipal court rules. Prosecutors relied heavily on objective evidence, including body-worn camera footage, dashboard recordings, and dispatch logs to establish a factual timeline of events. These materials were presented to the court to demonstrate how the encounter unfolded and whether Reynolds' actions aligned with departmental policies and statutory obligations. Testimony from supervising officers and internal affairs investigators provided context on standard operating procedures and clarified how deviations from those procedures are evaluated within the department. The prosecution argued that the evidence demonstrated clear inconsistencies between documented policy requirements and the actions taken during the incident. The defense emphasized Reynolds' length of service and prior professional record, presenting these factors as mitigating circumstances for the court's consideration. Defense counsel argued that Reynolds' experience reflected a history of public service and suggested that the discrepancies identified by investigators could be attributed to situational stress, judgment errors, or misinterpretation rather than deliberate misconduct. The defense also questioned the interpretation of certain video segments, arguing that perspective, camera angles, and incomplete audio could affect how actions were perceived. Judge Caprio addressed these arguments by clarifying the role of the court in evaluating evidence and applying the law impartially. During the proceedings, the judge noted that while experience and prior service are relevant during sentencing considerations, they do not alter the court's responsibility to determine whether the law was violated. The judge emphasized that legal standards governing official conduct exist to ensure consistency, accountability, and public confidence, particularly in cases involving individuals entrusted with enforcing the law. As testimony continued, the court examined the credibility of witnesses and the reliability of documentary evidence. Judge Caprio questioned witnesses directly, seeking clarification on departmental policies, reporting requirements, and training standards. This line of questioning aimed to establish whether the expectations placed on Reynolds were clear and whether those expectations were met during the incident in question. The court also reviewed the language used in Reynolds' written report, comparing it closely with time-stamped video evidence to assess accuracy and completeness. In evaluating the evidence, Judge Caprio referenced established legal principles that govern cases of official misconduct. These principles require proof that an official acted outside the scope of lawful authority or failed to perform required duties in a manner consistent with the law. The judge highlighted that the court's role is not to assess popularity, reputation, or institutional loyalty, but to determine compliance with legal obligations. This framework guided the court's analysis throughout the proceedings. When delivering the ruling, Judge Caprio stated that the court could not apply different standards based on rank or occupation. The judge explained that the legitimacy of the justice system depends on equal application of the law, particularly when public officials are involved. Allowing professional status to influence legal outcomes, the judge noted, would undermine public trust and contradict the foundational principles of the judicial system. This reasoning formed the basis of the court's decision on the charges presented. The ruling acknowledged Reynolds' service history, but concluded that the evidence supported the prosecution's claims that established procedures were not followed and that official documentation did not accurately reflect the recorded events. Judge Caprio explained that accountability mechanisms are designed to address precisely these circumstances, ensuring that authority granted by the public is exercised responsibly and transparently. The decision underscored that the court's responsibility is to the law itself rather than to any individual or institution. Legal observers noted that the court's approach reflected long-standing judicial standards applied in cases involving public officials. The emphasis on evidence-based findings and equal treatment under the law aligned with precedents requiring courts to scrutinize official conduct carefully. By focusing on verifiable facts rather than subjective interpretations, the ruling reinforced the expectation that legal outcomes must be grounded in documented proof and statutory requirements. The proceedings concluded with the court formally entering findings of guilt on the relevant counts, setting the stage for sentencing under applicable guidelines. Judge Caprio stated that the decision was based solely on the evidence and the law as written, reaffirming that the courtroom is a forum where all parties are subject to the same legal scrutiny. The handling of Key Point 2 illustrates how the judicial process evaluated the case through an impartial lens, demonstrating that professional authority does not exempt an individual from accountability, and that the rule of law remains the central standard by which conduct is judged. Following the court's findings of guilt, the proceedings moved into the sentencing phase, where the focus shifted from determining responsibility to establishing appropriate consequences under state law and judicial guidelines. The court reviewed statutory sentencing ranges applicable to the offenses, including official misconduct and falsification of records, and considered factors traditionally evaluated at this stage, such as the severity of the violations, the impact on public trust, and the need for deterrence. Prosecutors argued that sentencing should reflect the seriousness of the misconduct, emphasizing that accurate reporting and adherence to protocol are fundamental obligations for law enforcement officers, particularly those holding senior positions. Defense counsel presented arguments related to mitigation, highlighting Reynolds' length of service, prior commendations, and lack of previous criminal convictions. The defense requested leniency, asserting that penalties should recognize his professional background and the personal consequences already resulting from the case, including suspension from duty and reputational harm. The court acknowledged these submissions, noting that sentencing requires a balanced assessment of both aggravating and mitigating circumstances within the limits prescribed by law. Judge Frank Caprio outlined the legal framework governing sentencing, explaining that the primary objectives include accountability, proportionality, and the protection of public confidence in the justice system. The judge stated that while personal history and service record are considered, they cannot outweigh the necessity of enforcing standards that apply equally to all individuals. The court emphasized that sentencing decisions must reinforce the principle that authority granted to public officials carries corresponding responsibilities and consequences when those responsibilities are not met. In imposing the sentence, the court ordered Reynolds to pay fines consistent with statutory requirements and mandated completion of ethics and professional responsibility training. The judge explained that such training is intended not only as a corrective measure for the individual involved, but also as a safeguard to reduce the likelihood of similar violations in the future. Additionally, the court directed that the conviction be referred to the State Law Enforcement Standards and Certification Board for review, a step that could result in suspension or revocation of Reynolds' certification, depending on the board's independent assessment. The sentencing also included conditions related to compliance and reporting, ensuring that court orders would be monitored and enforced. Judge Caprio clarified that these conditions are standard in cases involving official misconduct and are designed to ensure adherence to legal and professional standards following a conviction. The court noted that failure to comply with any aspect of the sentence could result in further legal action. Following the sentencing, the Sheriff's Department released a formal statement acknowledging the court's decision and confirming that it would cooperate fully with any subsequent review by certification authorities. Department leadership reiterated its commitment to accountability and transparency, stating that the outcome demonstrated the department's willingness to address misconduct through established legal processes. Officials also indicated that internal policies and training programs would be reviewed to determine whether procedural changes or additional oversight measures were warranted. The case prompted attention from oversight organizations and legal analysts who examined the broader implications of the ruling. Commentators noted that the referral to the certification board underscores the layered accountability system governing law enforcement, in which criminal courts, administrative bodies, and professional regulators each play distinct roles. This multi-level approach is intended to ensure that misconduct is addressed comprehensively, beyond the immediate penalties imposed by the court. Public response to the sentencing reflected a range of perspectives, but official commentary remained focused on procedural outcomes rather than individual reactions. Legal experts emphasized that the case illustrates how sentencing serves not only to penalize specific actions, but also to reaffirm institutional standards. By applying established guidelines and articulating the rationale for each component of the sentence, the court provided a transparent explanation of how legal principles were translated into concrete consequences. The conclusion of the case did not mark the end of administrative review, as the certification board's process operates independently of the court. That process typically involves an evaluation of court records, investigative findings, and the officer's professional history to determine whether continued certification is appropriate. The outcome of such reviews can have lasting effects on an officer's ability to serve in law enforcement roles, reinforcing the long-term implications of judicial findings. In summarizing the case at the close of sentencing, Judge Caprio reiterated that the court's actions were guided by the law and the evidence presented. The judge stated that maintaining public trust requires consistent enforcement of legal standards and clear consequences when those standards are violated. The sentencing phase, the judge noted, was intended to reflect both accountability for the specific misconduct and the broader responsibility of the justice system to uphold integrity in public service. The handling of Key Point 3 demonstrates how judicial outcomes extend beyond a verdict, encompassing sentencing decisions, administrative reviews, and institutional responses. Through fines, mandated training, and referral for certification review, the case illustrates the structured mechanisms by which the legal system addresses misconduct by public officials. The resolution underscores that consequences are not limited to immediate penalties, but can include long-term professional implications, reinforcing the principle that adherence to legal and ethical standards is essential to the continued functioning and credibility of law enforcement institutions.